We're so excited you're here. I'm Brittany Sweetie. I'm the communications manager with the Livestock Conservancy, and I'm super excited to be joining Cindra here with me today.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're doing it a little differently today.
You know how internet is. You never know how it's going to go. Sometimes it feels like a Monday, but it's a Tuesday, so we're making it work. This is our make it work moment. And we could not be more excited to welcome Susan Schoenian. Is that how you? Okay, good. I got it right.
You're close.
I'm so sorry. I am terrible with names. But we are really excited that you're here to talk about sheep and sheep mud. Yay! Sheep! Cindra, do you want to introduce yourself and Susan?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Brittany. So I'm Cindra Kirscher, Program Coordinator for the Livestock Conservancy and for the Shave 'em to Save 'em program. And Susan is an extension specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, Sheep and Goats Extension. And I found out about Susan, gosh, I can't even tell you how many years ago, through my local extension office, actually. They were running a small ruminant clinic, and Susan came to speak at that. And then I started going down a rabbit hole and discovered some wonderful websites that Susan's been involved in, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag right now, because I know Brittany has a video to show. But welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is lovely to see you and to have you here on this chat.
Happy to be here.
Yay! So we're going to take like a quick 1-minute break. We have this fun video from ManaPro, our awesome sponsors for Sheep Chats this month. Thank you, ManaPro. So we will be back in 1 minute to jump into our talk today. Stick around.
Champions, colleagues,
roommates,
and personal trainers. Whatever role they play, they're an important part of our lives. In their quiet way,
and their not so quiet way.
They keep us young, on our feet, on the go. They pull us back to nature and push us toward the next adventure. And as much as we count on them, they count on us all the more.
To nurture their lives
with the same commitment. To protecting them, helping them grow, and thrive. Treating them as well as they treat us. By giving them a little more of our lives. Because no matter what role they play, out here or in here, we're here to make their lives the best they can be. ManaPro, nurturing life.
Yay, welcome back. Thank you to ManaPro for sponsoring our Sheep Chat today. We appreciate you, and thank you for featuring all of our awesome heritage breeders in that video. You might have seen a few familiar faces. All right. Well, Cindra, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Brittany. So, Susan, I did introduce you very briefly, saying that you were with the University of Maryland Extension, Sheep and Goat Extension. But how about you give us a little bit of your background? How long have you been with Extension?
I've been with University of Maryland Extension for almost 34 years. My first job was as a county ag agent on the lower eastern shore of Maryland, so the part down close to the ocean. And then I was a regional farm management specialist, so worked more on the money stuff. And then 20 years ago, I got the position I have now, which moved to the other part of the state in Western Maryland as the sheep and goat specialist. And we began research there with small ruminants pretty much when I got there. So we've had either sheep or goats at the research center almost every year since I've been there, doing a lot of different projects and learning a lot and having fun and meeting a lot of different people. I've been involved with sheep since I was, I think, 7 years old. I did the 4-H thing for 10 years and have been very involved with that kind of thing, and attended college at Virginia Tech. I got my master's at Montana State University, and I have a small flock of Katahdin sheep. I usually have between 35 and 40. And I sell breeding stock, and can't get away from sheep. It's my favorite topic.
Mine too. I love sheep. So your farm is called the Badlands, right?
Bad, not bad. Badlands.
Bad. How many A's in there? 2 or 3?
It's just the 2.
Okay. All right.
Just replace the D with the A. It has kind of a little story behind it because I had visited the Badlands.
The Badlands.
And then I was living in West Virginia. I was a sheep specialist there, and went to a little country festival, and there was this little chalk tablet, that said the Badlands with a little picture of a farm on it. Well, I didn't get my sheep for a number of years after that, but I kind of tucked it away in the attic, and then as soon as I finally got my little farm, that was going to be the name of it.
Awesome.
I love that.
That's very cute.
Yes.
Very, very cute. So Katahdins, they are a success story. They're a heritage breed, as many folks know, a meat breed, and they used to be on the Livestock Conservancy's conservation priority list. But they are in such good shape. They graduated a few years back, and we're super excited about that. And Susan, tell us a little bit about your, well, let me not jump down a rabbit hole too far. I invited Susan on today to talk to us a bit about general sheep husbandry. So for folks that are new or folks that just want a refresher, what I want to discuss are kind of what the need to knows are, what the must-haves and must-gets, must-learns kind of thing if you want to get into raising sheep. So let's start there. Big question.
Well, make sure you've got everything you need before you go out and buy those first sheep.
Mm-hmm.
Your building, your land, your equipment. Make sure you're ready for it. One of the biggest mistakes I think a lot of people make, and I'm guilty of it too, is sometimes you have more sheep than you had resources or have resources. Whether that's having too many for the pasture that you have, which leads to internal parasites, or maybe it's too many in the barn, which can also lead to internal parasites and other problems. Is do your homework and get things set up and don't exceed the capacity. If you've never raised sheep before, don't start with very many. And make sure when you buy sheep, be very careful where you buy them, because the number one most important thing to be successful in sheep is good biosecurity. Because some of the worst diseases, they walk onto your farm or they hop off of the truck. And so you want to start with healthy animals, and ideally from as few places as possible. If you have sheep and you buy more sheep, you want to make sure you quarantine and do things like that. One of the worst diseases in sheep is foot rot. You don't get foot rot by not trimming feet. You get foot rot because you buy it. Because most of the time it just walks onto your farm. And the other things can as well. Parasites are already on your farm once the first sheep come there, but some of the other ones you want to have good biosecurity to keep those diseases out. And then you try to keep your flock closed if you can, except maybe the introduction of males. Because particularly with heritage and minor breeds, it's hard to keep from inbreeding at times because there are not large populations of these breeds. So you usually need to bring in the males.
Yeah, so a lot of good questions came up for me in that fabulous, thorough answer. Thank you. One of which was stocking rate. So I do agree with the point that you made about if you're just first getting into sheep, just start with a few. And then the next thing, if you want to kind of size up, if you've spent a year or two getting comfortable with keeping sheep healthy, how do folks determine, since we are a national organization and we have folks from the East Coast to the West Coast, how do folks determine an appropriate stocking rate for their farm?
Unfortunately, there's usually no simple answer for that. If you were in one of the western states, maybe even West Texas, you're talking about how many acres animals need.
Right.
And then here in Maryland, where I live, we talk about how many animals we can put on an acre. And our rule of thumb out here is basically an animal unit, which is 1,000 pounds, like a cow. And of course, that'd be about 6 or 7 sheep, more goats, for 2 acres. So that's 2 or 3 sheep per acre. And that's really ballpark, because I look at my own farm. If I have 100 sheep in the spring, I have only 8 acres, probably 7 in pasture. They can't keep up with it in the springtime. It's too much. I could use more sheep. And then if I kept all of those sheep, including the lambs, through the summer, I'm not going to have enough. And then in the fall, of course, the pastures are kind of going to experience that second growth spurt. So the forage is available different amounts at different times of the year. There's things you can plant for grazing, late into the year, early into the year. And of course, again, we've got the geographic differences and how you manage it. If you have one field and you just stick the sheep out there, you're going to get the least productivity out of that land. If you develop a good rotational grazing system, one of the benefits of that can be that you increase your carrying capacity, stocking rate.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what kind of plants you have and this sort of thing. It's like I said, unfortunately, it is not an easy answer.
It's not a one size fits all. Yeah.
No. I mean, yeah, and it also has to do with what do you do with your lambs. So, are you going to put the lambs with their mom to finish on grass? And that can't be done everywhere in the U.S. and that can't be done on every farm. It can be done though. I mean, sheep are the only animal that will finish in the choice grade off of pasture. Or are you going to sell them young? Market them for Easter or whatever, or put them in dry lot situation and feed the lambs out? Because obviously, you're going to need more pasture if you're going to try to finish your lambs on grass.
Mm-hmm.
You can have more ewes on your pasture if you feed the lambs out. But not everybody wants to do that because there's the growing demand for grass-fed lamb.
So would you recommend folks, if they want to answer that question more specifically for their own farm and their own situation, recommend reaching out to their county extension agent for that?
Absolutely. Reach out to your county extension agent and also the National Resource Conservation Service, particularly if you already have a sheep farm, because it's possible to get cost share. In fact, I just read an article about $1 billion is going to be for farms to adopt practices that are good for climate change, and one of them is one of them they listed as rotational grazing. So,
nice.
So extension doesn't have money to give you; they have expertise to give you. Whereas NRCS is called the EQUIP program, and there's always a possibility. And so, yeah, you definitely want to get acquainted. And not everybody has a county extension person that's knowledgeable in sheep.
Right.
So sometimes it requires maybe reaching out to somebody a little bit further out of your county, or looking. Very often, a state has a state sheep and goat specialist, and other organizations as well. Like there's a lot of sustainable ag organizations that do work with small ruminants as well. And then there's always the web. But
so let's talk about the web real quick, because this is the thing that I didn't want to give away. And I absolutely love this website because this is a perfect place for people to start if they don't know a whole lot about raising sheep or sheep in general. Susan's website is sheep101.info. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And on that website are two other things. The 101 is to try to get, it's just really a basic information about sheep, what we use them for, how they're typically raised, just a lot of different things. 201 is a beginner's guide to raising sheep. There's like 30, I'm trying to remember how many chapters there are, maybe there's 50 chapters. And so they're all broken down by topic. And it's only online right now, but one of the things on my to-do list is to publish it as a book. And then another part I added last year was Q&A. So there's about 30 to 40 Q&A, something like, are dewormers safe? Should I breed my ewe lambs? Questions like that. What's the best hay? And of course, a lot of the questions I put on there, we mentioned that what's the appropriate stocking rate? No easy answer to that. What's the best hay? No easy answer to that.
Right.
So the answers are actually quite long at times. And then I have a website called sheepandgoat.com, which is kind of meant to be kind of a launching pad for finding information. And then I maintain the website for the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. That's a mouthful, so we call it WormX, wormx.info. And that is the go-to place for information about parasites. And we have information, obviously we focused originally in the Southeast, but now we have members all across the country, and there's been a lot of work in the West trying to quantify some of the parasite issues out there, and that's all available on that website.
3 very valuable websites. If you're raising sheep or thinking about getting into them, do go check those out. All right, Susan, back to your answer before. One of the things you talked about was biosecurity and not bringing a problem onto your farm. And that brought up a question for me, because I've worked on I've had my own sheep, and I've also worked on a farm with sheep. And I've managed not to bring anything back home to my sheep, but I have noticed that on this particular farm, sheep tend to have problems year after year after year. And I'm wondering how long, if you get something like foot rot in your soil, how long does that field have to be vacant before you can get rid of that?
The bacteria that causes foot rot only survives about 2 weeks
Okay.
on the pasture,
Okay.
and much longer on the sheep.
Mm-hmm.
But that fact factors into how we can eradicate foot rot on a farm,
Mm-hmm.
where we put clean animals. So 2 weeks is about how long. Now the bacteria that causes foot scald, which is
Mhm.
between the digits, that bacteria is going to be present anywhere where there are sheep, goats, or cattle.
Okay.
And so that can have what I call an environmental cause. Things are wet and, overstocked, things like
Mhm.
that. It may appear to be contagious, but technically it's not, because that bacteria is always there. Foot rot, highly contagious, is a bacteria that is introduced often from, like I said, buying some sheep that had it.
Mhm.
It's one of the reasons you want to stay clear of buying sheep at a sale barn, like a public auction,
Mhm.
because some people take the animals they need to get rid of there, including ones with foot rot. And also you're commingling at those yards, and you never know what you could pick up. So that's not an ideal place to purchase sheep.
Mhm. Yeah, as far as commingling and bringing things home, parasites as well, potentially, correct?
Well, the parasites that infect sheep are there. If you have sheep, they're there. What you can introduce are resistant parasites. And so one of the other things, if you buy sheep and you put them in quarantine, that's also where we address resistant parasites. So we want people to deworm the animals in quarantine, and to use a drug from each of the 3 groups of dewormers. So valbazen, cydectin,
Mhm.
and prohibitor or levamisole. Those are the most potent drugs in each of those classes. We call that a combination treatment, because when we have an animal in quarantine and we don't want it to introduce resistant worms, we want to clean them out of worms the best we can. And we want to quarantine in a pen, not on pasture.
Mhm. And approximately how long would you recommend
I would say
quarantining?
a minimum of 2 weeks, but preferably 4 weeks.
Okay.
And like I said, away from everybody, no fence line contact. If you really take it seriously, you'll take care of them last, kind of like shearing certain sheep last. But ideally, the last thing you want to do is go buy a ram and plop him right in with your ewes. And I can tell you, people do that all the time. But ideally, if you want to, everything in life is about minimizing risk. And so if you really want to minimize the risk of introducing something, then you will follow through with that quarantine program. And that includes animals that have gone off to the fair. Animals that have gone off to the fair or a festival, treat them as if you just bought them, and put them into quarantine as well. Because you definitely can pick up things at the fairs and festivals as well.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about using the 3, drugs for worming. What is your recommendation? Because I know that's not necessarily everybody's approach. And I think some people are still using some outdated recommendations on worming. What is your approach to entire flock worming or just individual worming?
Everything practically that I learned as a child is wrong.
And,
there
we go.
and when you think about it, it makes sense. Our answer to parasites, worms, has always been to shove a drug down the throat. And again, we did it on schedules. We did it on so many weeks, so many times a year. We totally just focused on the animal. And what that caused after so many years is it caused those dewormers to become, or those worms, specifically the barber pole worm, to become resistant to those drugs. And it doesn't always mean people did something wrong because they were following recommendations. It's like antibiotics. It's inevitable. The first time a drug is used, maybe 0.001% will survive. And that is the beginning of resistance. So farms vary in the level of resistance that they have to the drugs. It's worse in the southeast where sheep require more frequent deworming. And it's less, if you go up into, your dry area like West Texas or up in the mountain states or just farther north. So they still have resistance, but it's not to the level it is here or in the south. Because worms are, if you do a fecal egg count, so you collect the fecal and count the eggs, and if you kill 95% of the eggs, that's considered an effective treatment or effective drug. If you kill 80%, you've got resistance, but probably that 80% efficacy is still going to help that animal. But what happens when you start going down to 60%, 50%, 40%? You're only killing some of the parasites. And so the new approaches, and they've been around for probably 20 years now, because that's how long our consortium has been around, is to no longer do whole flock treatments in general, because you're deworming a lot of animals that don't need dewormed. And the only worms that survive from that group are now resistant to the dewormer. So now we recommend targeted selective treatment, treating or not treating an animal based on certain knowledge. Mm-hmm. And the other recommendation is when you have an animal that's clinically parasitized, then you give it the 3 drugs. And that will work as an additive. So if you had 1,000 eggs per gram, which is actually not a very high egg count, but makes the math easy. If the first one drug killed, well, let's say they all kill 80%. You just do the math. There's 200 eggs left, and then the second drug kills 80% of those, and you kill as many worms as you can possibly. And then you don't deworm animals that don't need deworming. And we have tools, and I can talk about those, that help us make those deworming decisions.
Mm-hmm. Let's go right into that.
Well, hopefully listeners are familiar with the FOMACHA system. Mm-hmm. That system it's a card. I have one I could show it on the screen, but I don't know where it is from where I am right now. So it's a card that shows 5 scores. We look at the lower eyelid, the membranes in the lower eyelid, to see if the animal is anemic. So anemic would be like a very pale pink or a white. And a healthy animal that's not anemic is going to be red or a kind of a pinkish red. And we have 5 scores, and that can help us make decisions on the barber pole worm, which for most people, not everybody, but for most farms, that is the primary parasite. It's a blood sucker. It causes anemia. So it causes mucous membranes to get pale. You can look at the lips or the gums. You can even look at the vulva. But the research to create the FOMACHA card is looking at the color of the lower eyelid. But there are parasites besides those that suck blood. So another system that was developed after the FOMACHA system, and these were actually developed in South Africa, is called the 5-point check. And with the 5-point check, you look at 5 different places on the animal's body to help make a deworming decision. So that can help with the worms that cause more of a digestive upset or diarrhea. It can also help you make decisions on animals that score 3. So there's 5 scores. You don't deworm 1 and 2. You deworm 4 and 5, and there's a big old question mark at 3. So you can kind of look at the 5-point check to make that decision. The 5 checkpoints are the eye for the FOMACHA system, the jaw for bottle jaw, an accumulation of fluid under the jaw, which happens with the barber pole worm, happens with liver fluke, happens with really bad nutrition. You can get that. The back, body condition scoring, and body condition scoring by itself can be a pretty good indicator for adult animals, not so much for lambs, but for adult animals. And then you look at the tail for signs of scouring. how much poop might be accumulating on the backside. And then the fifth one, which I don't think we focus on too much in this country, but probably some places in the US, is the nasal blot. Is looking at the nose to see if there's a discharge for nasal blots. And so generally speaking, you would use all 5 of those to make that deworming decision. You wouldn't just use one. Although if it's a FAMACHA 5, so a pale white, nothing else matters. You go ahead and would treat that animal. Other criteria that can be used to make deworming decisions, and they do a lot more of this in other parts of the world, is looking at performance, looking at the average daily gain. It's been proven and tested with the worms that don't, like the brown stomach worm, the bankrupt worm, the ones that don't cause the anemia. And so they decide what the lambs should be gaining. And then if they don't gain up to what they should, then they'll be dewormed. And so it works similar to FAMACHA, that you're selecting ones that don't need dewormed. So it's having a similar result. Another kind of performance way to look at it is one of the most important animals when we talk about worms is the parapartrident female. So the female that's in the latter part of her pregnancy and lactation. So about 2 weeks before parturition and about 8 weeks after. That's the parapartrident female. Whatever immunity she has developed with her age is compromised at the time of lambing. And so we focus treatments on, or we focus on her. In the past, we just dewormed everybody. Either before lambing or at lambing. A lot of people would do it when she was in the jug, or some people would do it after. Well, we'd rather not do that anymore because of the resistance issues. So at least if you can pull out some that don't need deworm. Sometimes you can look at FAMACHA the other way. Instead of who needs deworm, who doesn't need dewormed. And so if the parapartrident female meets one of several criteria, if she's in below 2 body condition score, so that's 1 to 5, 2 is thin, you deworm her. If she has a FAMACHA score of 4 or 5, you deworm her. And then how many babies does she have? Singles and twins, you shouldn't have to deworm, but if you know she's got 3, either you scan for fetal numbers or she lambs and has 3, you focus the treatment on her. And then the other one would be if you breed the young ewes to be moms when they're yearlings, they're also kind of a risk group. So I would definitely deworm most of them, or at least those that have twins. Because a yearling with twins is kind of equivalent to a mature ewe with 3. So and with I doubt we have too many dairy folks on here, but like one of the things they do recommend in Europe with dairy goats is to deworm the high performers, because stress, even independent of like the worm cycle, stress is a major cause of parasites.
Mm-hmm. Yep, stress is a factor in all species in regards to health, how we fight things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Susan, for those who are not assessing daily weight gain, how often do you feel like both the FAMACHA and the 5-point system should be looked at?
It depends on where you're located.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, if I compare Nevada to Maryland,
right.
It matters how you raise them. If you have them in dry lot, no vegetation, they don't have any source of infection. If you're out on grass, in our part of the country, we recommend checking every 2 weeks and for FAMACHA scores during what I would call worm season. Probably in our southeastern states, it's almost a year-round problem. Or in the Caribbean or the tropics, it's a year-round problem. Up here, it's more like it kind of coincides with baseball season. So in the early spring, it's kind of a lot of it, the parapartrident ewe is kind of seeding those pastures with worms. And the worms that had kind of gone into a rested state over winter, they're also kind of waking up and starting to contaminate the pastures. You can get clinical parasitism in the early spring, April, May, and I'm talking kind of like a Maryland, middle of the road climate. But most of the problems are in the summertime. June, July, August, September. And then as we move into the fall, we get frost, then, they become less of a problem. There's no real need to check animals in our climate in January, but in Louisiana, that could be different. Mm-hmm. So you kind of got to know where you're at and what your risk is. And there's some instances where weekly checks. I mean, the weather, the climate's very conducive to the worms, warm and moist. So if you get, you're getting some rainfall, especially in humid climates, there can be some situations where once weekly. And others probably can feel more confident, going out 3 weeks or something like that. And then once the ewes have weaned their lambs, they shouldn't have to be checked every 2 weeks unless you're putting them in a really challenging environment, because they should sort of be on vacation, except the ones that are in an accelerated program. But those are usually better fed.
Mm-hmm.
I answer questions long, don't I?
That's
They're
okay.
great answers. They're very detailed, and that's what folks like. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So does forage height, I have a vague recollection in the back of my head. Does forage height play a role in parasite management?
Absolutely. In fact, what we'd like producers to think is that deworming is your last resort, and you failed them. No, but we want to rely on the management. When we use the dewormers, we want to use them right, and we want to alleviate the clinical signs and regain production. But we want to do everything we can to not have to deworm. And you mentioned the height of the forage. Definitely, most of the larvae. So the sheep gets infected when they eat the third stage larva. If eggs are in the feces, they hatch, they go through several molts, they become third stage larvae. They stay closest to where the moisture is. So that's the further down on the ground. So the first 2 inches, they say, counts for about 80% of the larva. 80%. If you've got an animal that's grazing, that's browsing, and sheep will do some browsing, there's no source of infection up on that browse. But of course, we know sheep like their head on the ground. But you shouldn't graze pastures shorter than 3 or 4 inches, not only for parasites, but also for the vigor of the plants. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of other pasture strategies. If you can rotate them every 4 days onto another paddock. And that's based on the rationale that it takes a minimum of 3 or 4 days for that egg to hatch and develop into the third stage larva. In most cases, it probably takes more than 4 days. But by doing it at 4 days, they shouldn't be reinfecting themselves. Okay. Mm-hmm. But just as important as how quickly you move them is how quickly do they come back to that paddock. If that paddock has not had sufficient rest period, then you're just putting them back on a highly contaminated pasture. And how long you have to rest that pasture depends on the season. It depends on the location. Again, it's one of those. It doesn't take extension people very long to learn that the most common answer is it depends. which is frustrating because parasites, we wish it was an easy answer. It's not. It's a complicated answer. There's a lot of tools out there. We now have bioworma, which can be it's a feed through product. It's a fungus, and that fungus traps and kills the larva in the manure of livestock. It's not inexpensive, but when you have valuable sheep or whatever else you've done is just not working, it's worth looking into. And especially if you're limited on acreage, it could be something that you try. It will significantly reduce the larva on pasture. We can graze multiple species. For the most part, cattle and sheep don't share the same parasites. There's just a little crossover, and sheep don't share parasites with horses either. They do with goats, and they do with camelids. So different things like that. We can plant annuals, give us clean pasture. There's just different strategies that we can use. Some people will delay, if they pen them overnight, they'll delay grazing until the dew lifts in the morning. Because again, the larva is going to be wherever the moisture is. They don't have wings. They can't fly up to 10 inches. Mm-hmm. So the higher you get in the forage, the much less parasite infection is going to be. And there, besides pasture management, there's genetic selection. There's just lots of different strategies, and everybody can't do every recommendation out there, but they can find that combination of tools that works with their animals. And keep in mind, what worked this year might not work next year. You always got to be prepared to change. What works for your neighbor may not work for you. What works but there are a lot of different things you can do. Parasites aren't going away, and they are the primary health problem we have, particularly with grazers, and grazing is generally the way we want to go.
Good answer. Thank you. So some of the other things that I wanted to touch on for shepherds who are currently raising sheep and probably already know this and don't need it repeated to them, but also folks who are thinking about getting into sheep, is the importance of establishing a relationship very early on, not just with either a county or a state extension agent, but also with your veterinarian, a livestock veterinarian. Can you talk a little bit about that, Susan?
Yes, it's very important that everybody have a veterinarian. And the need is increasing because, and I don't know the exact timeline, but eventually you will not be able to buy antibiotics at the feed or farm store. You will need a prescription. And while I'm not an advocate of using a lot of antibiotics, you want to use them when you need to. And so the only way you're going to be able to get those products is to have a relationship with a veterinarian. And there are other medications sometimes that we would like to use with sheep that are not approved. The only way we can legally do that is if a veterinarian uses it himself on your farm or writes a prescription. And that's not even considering the knowledge that they have, because you're like form a team. You form a team, and that's the ideal situation. And a lot of people are concerned because sometimes it's very hard to find a veterinarian that will work with sheep, or to find one that is knowledgeable about sheep. That's a challenge, and there are things underway that's trying to address this shortage of veterinarians that work with large animals. So maybe things can improve in the future, but you definitely want to have a veterinarian. And in most vets, I think less than 10% of vets are large animal vets. So most of the work is going to be done by those with mixed animal practices. So even if you have a vet for your dog and cat and they're not a sheep vet, if you can get them to work with sheep and you kind of can learn together. There's things we have to do to help the vets to make this work. And you got one sheep that's sick or is delivering a lamb and you can't get it out, put it in the back of your SUV and take it to the vet. We can do things like that, because that's a very important relationship. And right now people use medications they use them extra label, which means it's not a labeled species, and they just go to the store and buy it. But I think those days are coming to an end. If the veterinarian is going to be accountable for the use of the medications, he or she's going to need to be familiar with your operation. Very important.
Thank you, Susan. So something else I want to talk about, which I know is specific to sheep, copper.
Yes.
Copper toxicity is a concern.
Yes, on average, just sheep on average they're more susceptible to copper toxicity because the range between what they need and what can become toxic is very narrow. I mean, they absolutely need copper, but we can get into problems because it's it's also very the metabolism of copper is very complicated. The National Research Council no longer gives a toxic level of copper for sheep because it depends on the presence of other minerals, specifically molybdenum, but there's even a few others, because molybdenum binds with copper, makes it unavailable. So you don't want to go around adding copper because copper sounds like it's good. If you think you have a deficiency issue, and deficiency issues do exist, I had one here on my farm. If you do, you want to have some knowledge to back that up, and you can test. Unfortunately, you need to test the livers or kidneys, and unfortunately, that requires a dead animal. So if you sell a lamb for meat, or you put one in the freezer, you could get the liver and have it tested. I think Michigan State University is one of the ones that does the testing. If you have one that dies, that's something it would be good to know what your mineral status is. You can test the status of the feeds and the forages, and that can give you an idea. But excess copper is stored in the liver, and so that's where we determine whether we got low levels. And if you get a mineral profile done on a liver, you learn more than just about copper. But one of the confusing things is nowadays we promote copper oxide wire particles as a dewormer. If I'm a goat producer, it doesn't really scare me, because we know goats need and can tolerate more copper. But with sheep, you'd hate to be for that to be the thing that finally tips the bucket. The chances of it causing problems are not real high, because it's a slow release, more not as well absorbed form of copper. Years ago, we used to deworm with copper sulfate, which was highly toxic. It had some efficacy against worms, but it also probably killed its fair share of animals. We used to deworm with gasoline. That one totally blows my mind. People don't like medications and drugs, right? Well, I can tell you that the dewormers that we have nowadays are far more safe for the animals than what we used to use. Copper sulfate, nicotine sulfate, gasoline. I saw that in an animal health textbook. So copper can be part of a deworming program or a parasite control program, but you kind of like to use it with some knowledge to back it up, and secondly, you definitely want to apply it selectively.
And I think the other thing that's important to add is that there's a lot of similarities between sheep and goats. They're both small ruminants, and the non-scholarly folks often think, well, things are pretty interchangeable between the two. But when you're talking about going to the feed store and buying some supplemental feed, what you find labeled for goats is not usually something you want to give to sheep, unless you know that there's no copper in there.
Correct. And if you commingle, you have sheep and goats, and a lot of people do have both of them. You have to feed the sheep product, and then maybe find another way to get more copper into the goats. But because sheep and goats are very similar, almost every disease they both get. Nutritionally, there's a lot of similarities, But yeah, copper is one of the ones that's different. And then, of course, they're like on opposite sides of the coin on behavior. But most of the programs I do as an extension person are always for sheep and goats together. But it's always important to talk about where they differ. Where they differ, and they do. Even though they have a grazing behavior that's less conducive to getting parasites, most people have them grazing. They don't have them browsing.
So let's talk about a few more health-related topics, Susan. We talked about biosecurity, establishing relationship with the vet. We talked a little bit about parasites, worming, foot rot. There's some other things out there that are pretty important for folks to be aware of when it relates to sheep. One of which, if you're going to purchase some sheep, especially if you're thinking about crossing state lines with that sheep, you need to know a thing or two about scrapie.
Absolutely. And the good thing is we're fairly close to eradicating it in this country, but it is the hardest ones to find are the last ones. So every person that owns a sheep or goat, their animal needs to be identified. If it leaves the farm, enters commerce. If it dies on that farm, no, it didn't need a scrapie identification. So it's essentially an ear tag. You can use tattoos, but and that identification has helped us make so much progress. So if they sample cull ewes at a slaughterhouse and one comes up, one has scrapie, then it can be traced back. And, so the ear tags have been, or identification has been vital to eradicating scrapie. As a disease, it's not that common. It's one of those big picture diseases that could affect, think about when mad cow first hit Britain, how that affected it. Well, scrapie, if all was, we need to get rid of it for those reasons. I mean, the chances of you getting scrapie in your flock are pretty slim. But it's very important that we continue to work towards eradication. And
Yeah, good.
And it's required. It's required. Some sale barns will charge you to tag them. Some will not accept your animals. I suspect in the future, and I don't know how long in the future this is going to be, everything's going to have an electronic ID eventually.
Mm-hmm. Everything's going electronic.
Right. Right. It's just a matter of how I for the last year, I served on a committee with ASI, American Sheep Industry Association, about how can we transition to electronic ID. Mm-hmm. And the country is so diverse, and the production systems are so diverse. It's some of them. It's hard to figure out how we can do it. There's some animals that don't get touched until they go to the market, and so some of those challenges have to be overcome.
Yeah.
But the tags aren't expensive. I don't really think it would be a hardship on a small producer, because they're not that expensive.
Yeah.
But we do need to care about scrapie. We do. We need to get rid of it. And if you ever have an animal die of something neurological or wasting, it's not a bad idea to get it tested.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's talk about vaccinations. What's your vaccinating philosophy in regards to sheep?
Well, there's only one set of diseases that probably sheep need to be vaccinated for worldwide, and that's Clostridial diseases. Mm-hmm. So they're bacterial diseases that are somewhat natural to the environment or to the animal's gut. Mm-hmm. And so for most producers, they probably only need to vaccinate for 3, what we typically call C, D, T. So C and D are they're Clostridia perfringens, type C and D. There's actually 5 types, and C and D is the ones most common. Type D is what we classically call overeating disease, or enterotoxemia. It's not so much that they eat too much. What is it? They all of a sudden, if they have an increase in nutrition, especially from like pasture to forage, or all of a sudden just they're able to eat too much. That's why they call it overeating disease. The T stands for tetanus, and tetanus is a pretty common organism. So the recommendation, most widely accepted, is to vaccinate the parapartridge female about a month before she's due the lamb. There was a study a number of years ago at Cornell University that looked at doing the ewe versus the lambs when they were very young, and it wasn't very effective doing the lambs when they were young. So ideally, like I said, you want to do the mama. And then if you do that, then you can do the lambs when they're 6 to 8 weeks, the first one, and then 4 weeks later. You can never vaccinate too much for CDT or enterotoxemia. That's the other name we give those diseases. And in orphans, for example, ones that we artificially rear, some people recommend vaccinating them every couple of months. Every couple of weeks. Because they're just more susceptible, and quick as you can get little orphan lambs off the bottle, the better, because then they'll be much less risk for having problems. But and that's the general recommendation. There are vaccines for other things. There's vaccines for 2 of the common causes of abortion. There's a vaccine for CL, caseous lymphadenitis. There's a vaccine for sore mouth. There's an elusive vaccine for foot rot. It's not widely available, but there is one. There's one for rabies. There are vaccines for pneumonia. There's now a vaccine not for sheep, but for goats for mastitis. So how do you figure out if you should do any more? It's you can talk this over with your veterinarian. but it's going to depend on your, what do you feel is the risk on your farm. Some vaccines shouldn't be given unless you already have the disease, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's kind of like the COVID vaccine. They don't prevent all incidences of COVID by any means, but they lessen the effects. So the some of the vaccines are like that. And one of the things I didn't say about the Clostridial vaccines, there is one that's an 8-way. It's called Covaxin 8. It has C, D, and T in it, and then it has some additional Clostridial diseases, redwater disease, blackleg. I'm just trying to think a couple of those. And if, again, I talk that over with my veterinarian and see if I think I need to, I need to use that. It's similar. It's a bigger dosage on the first. The CDT is a 2 cc. The Covaxin, I think, is a 5 and then a 2. But that vaccine is certainly used as well. So you have to decide whether you think you need that. And like I said, the other ones is kind of an as-need basis and depends on how you're raising your sheep. A lot of people that are in enclosed housing for lambing might have pneumonia problems if the ventilation's not good, things like that. And CL, I think is better to call myself, but you can imagine if people had, hundreds or 1,000 animals, that might not be the way that, the way they want to go. Sore mouth, if I showed, I might be concerned about that. We used to vaccinate all the bucks in our buck test at the research center for sore mouth because invariably somebody brought it, and then that was unfair to the naive goats to then get sore mouth. So we started vaccinating them under the tail head. Sheep you usually do it under the hind leg where you have just skin. But for some people, rabies vaccine, and your veterinarian would have to give that. But if your animals are being used for kind of public things like grazing management or a petting farm or something like that, you can consider those as well. And in the future, I think vaccines are going to become more important because antibiotics are going to be used more sparingly. It's a lot of people, to prevent abortions, will give injections or feed an antibiotic. Well, the vaccine is probably going to be the better choice. So I think those are important, and hopefully we get more vaccines. And of course, we all know it's a big topic right now.
For sure.
But it's important for sheep health, a vaccination program, and to do it right. You don't give one, got to booster them. And if that lamb's been boosted, if the lamb's gotten its full course of vaccines, at least 2, when that lamb becomes a mama, you'll just need to boost her. If you didn't vaccinate her, there'd probably be some immunity passed on in the colostrum, but you're going to maximize that immunity by boosting her in her last month of pregnancy. No closer than 2 weeks, but about a month out. I'm doing that this week on mine.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So we're winding up the hour here, and I know we have some questions and comments, so I think we better dig into those.
Yes, we have a bunch of questions. People are very excited. All right, let's see. Let's dive in. Hi, Christy. Thanks for joining us today. We're glad you're here. Christy says, where should I test incoming sheep and what tests to run during quarantine?
Great question.
That's a great question. The majority of people don't do anything. When you think about it, the majority of both the buyer and seller, we just blindly buy and sell sheep. I would, if you want to raise the bar higher on your farm, you could test for OPP. We haven't talked about that one. OPP is ovine progressive pneumonia. It's there's no cure for it. It causes, it can affect any of the body system, but it mostly affects, our most common symptom is hard bag, mastitis, both sides. You'll see this like perfectly formed udder and no milk or very little milk. And so I've met many a producer over the years that had to go through the process to try to repopulate or eradicate OPP from their flock. So that would be one you can test for CL. If you want to know if an individual sheep on your farm has CL, it has an abscess, you want to test the abscess to see if it has CL. But as part of a control and eradication program, you can test for CL with a blood test. Yonis is kind of a ticking bomb out there, but that's another one that can be tested for. And then depending on the breed, there's some, I was looking at the Southdown website the other day or something, and there's a whole bunch of, I don't know, I'm going to call them genetic problems that they test for. Scrapie, you can test to see what their genotype is, because scrapie is not caused by genetics, but the genetics of the animal affects if it would get scrapie, if it was exposed to the infected organism. We don't tend to do as much scrapie genotyping as we used to, because we're getting closer to eradicating it, but that is something you could do. You could say, well, I only want an RR ram, so you want the seller to test for that. Ideally, you want the test done before they come to your farm, ideally. And hopefully more and more people are doing some of this testing. But I know if I wanted to start a sheep flock and I wanted OPP, even OPP free, there'd be very few I could buy from. If I wanted OPP, CL, and Yonis free, I wonder how many of those exist. It's a challenging. And then, of course, I already talked about parasites in quarantine. This is this is a situation where we'd really like to get a negative fecal test. So you can do it before and after, but mostly you want to do it after to see if the treatments that you gave it have been effective. I mean, the longer an animal stays in quarantine, the less worms are going to be in its system, but a month is not going to do it. To get rid of all worms. We'd have bucks in our buck tests or research project. They'd have been in the pen for 4 months and they still ran positive egg counts. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, the two most important diseases in sheep are parasites and foot rot. So the other thing I would look at, one, I wouldn't buy a sheep from any place without, quizzing them about things, observing carefully. And remember, when it's dry, you don't really see limping sheep. But I'd look at every foot, and then I'd trim it and spray zinc sulfate or some copper tox or something on it. One time I wanted to buy a group of polypays from a large farm, and I knew they had foot rot. In fact, they had a whole barn that was just the foot bath. But I selected 10 of them, and I lifted every foot. They didn't have foot rot. And when I got them home, before they left the trailer, I trimmed their feet and squirted copper tox on them. So they didn't have that either. Mm-hmm. So that worked. So lots of things before you buy sheep. Lots of things. But like I said, I still think that our biggest concerns are the resistant worms and the foot problems. Pink eye, sore mouth, they also can be bothersome diseases that can come in when you buy animals. And steer clear of anything with an abscess. If you buy from a farm and you see an abscess, but it's not the one they're selling, you don't know what that abscess is. Not all abscesses are CL. I've had sheep get abscesses and I've tested them and they've always been something else. When we had our buck test, 50% of them were CL.
All right, great question. Hi, Helen. Thanks for joining us today. Helen says, we have a routine foot trimming routine, but one ewe always gets overgrown hooves. Will she pass this trait on to her lambs?
There's certainly a chance she will. We've seen, we used to evaluate I hate to keep going back to goats, but we did a goat project for 11 years and we looked at their feet. And we had this one line of goats that had, it's just a really abnormal growth, not just overgrown, but abnormal. And it was one of the top performers in the test for the other traits. And I said, no, we're not selling it. And then he said, well, I'll take it home and sell it. I said, no. He's going to the sale barn. And we had seen that trait in some of his other consignments of that overgrown hoof. So, what the heritability of hoof growth is, I don't know. But I'm sure we have a lot of things like this. I'm sure there's a genetic component to it. And if you don't want overgrown hooves, then I would say get rid of her. Now, I know a lot of times we have small flocks and that every sheep in that flock is valuable to us. So, sometimes you can't do that, but you just, like I said, there is a chance that she can pass this on to her offspring. Again, I can't cite you a heritability, and then the environment's probably far more important. A lot of problems that have a genetic component are still like 90% environmental. So, and you say a routine foot trimming routine, 2 routines. The one thing I will say is be careful not to over trim hooves. We're concerned that people trim hooves for the health and welfare of the animal, but sometimes we can over trim them and that can open that hoof up to bacteria. So, they don't have to look perfect all the time, but obviously we don't want overgrown hooves as well.
Good question. Thank you, Helen. Hi, Dalton. Thanks for joining us today. Dalton says, do you recommend purchasing a microscope for your own fecal tests during quarantine and routine checks?
If you like that kind of stuff, yeah. Every year when I teach a FOMACHA workshop, when we were doing them face-to-face, COVID converted to online, we would do fecal egg counting as part of our hands-on training. And I don't know, it was more of an appreciation for the ones who do it, kind of like shearing school, It's you appreciate the people that do that. But you can do it. You can do it. And it can kind of come in handy. Because you can do the best use of fecal egg counts, a couple of them. One is to see if the drug worked. So you have one sheep, you took its fecal egg count, it was 4,000 eggs per gram. Depending on the drug, you come back 1 to 2 weeks later, do another fecal sample, and it's 6,000 eggs per gram. That treatment didn't work. It didn't work. And it kills half of them or 90% of them. Okay. If you want to find out if you have resistance to the drugs, you want to test more than one animal. Ideally, at least 10. Okay. So 1 tells you if it worked on that animal. 10 will tell you if you've got resistance to that drug. It can also be used to identify animals that are more resistant to parasites. And something tells me a lot of heritage breeds, because they aren't managed as intensively, maybe there's some that are more resistant. But when you do your own fecals, you're identifying the resistance within your own flock. If you ever want to compare them, you have to go outside of your own flock with EBVs or something like that. And you can also monitor pasture contamination by doing fecals. You can do kind of a pooled, just general one. But yeah, you can. There's lots of presentations and PowerPoints on how to do fecals. And you want to do egg counting. You don't want to do what most vets, not all of them, but most vets just do a simple flotation and they look for the presence of eggs. You want to know the number. In the case of the animal in quarantine, obviously we want that to be as close to 0 as possible. It may not be 0, but we want to get it down. So yeah, and the microscope, I'd say a few $100s. You want to get a mechanical stage. You want to have a 100x, so a 10x eyepiece and at least a 10x. Yeah. I bought some cheap little thing off of Amazon that it was like $30 and I was hoping it would work. No. Usually get what you pay for.
That's a good recommendation.
And if you want to do fecals and you really don't want to do them, if you know what I mean, we have in our consortium we have either 3 universities that will do low-cost fecal egg counting, $5.
Oh wow,
that's
really
a lot
reasonable.
cheaper than a diagnostic lab. That's a lot cheaper than most veterinarians. If your veterinarian wants to work with you and make that part of your animal, your program, I would work with them. But otherwise, you can get them done for $5, and you just have to mail them on ice, chilled. Mm-hmm. So $5. And that's for any, and so if you wanted to test, again, drug resistance and you had 15 animals you could use, you could send those off, or if you want to do it for genetics. Because when I say parasite resistance, that has to do with whether the animal gets infected, how many eggs it produces, that sort of thing. We quantify that with fecal egg counts because we assume there's more eggs means more worms. If the animal doesn't need dewormed, that means he's resilient. He either doesn't have a lot of infection because he's resistant, but he could have plenty of worms and eggs, but he can handle it, and that's resilient. And that's what the FOMACHA system body condition score, 5-point check, is looking at: resilience, tolerance. The two traits are linked, but not one-to-one.
Great. Just one more question about the FOMACHA. Is it only effective for barber pole?
The FOMACHA system is only effective for blood-feeding parasites. So barber pole worm is a bloodsucker. I believe the hookworm is, but I don't think it's a common problem. Liver flukes can also cause anemia, and there has been a study or two looking at whether FOMACHA could be useful for liver flukes, because it's like a totally different kind of parasite. And that was why the development of a 5-point check came out, because there are areas and there are times when other parasites are a problem. Primarily, it's what we call Teller dorsasia and Trichostrongylis. Add that to barber pole worm, which is Haemachus contortus. Those three parasites, they look the same when you do an egg count. To find out which ones you have to actually, the larva has to be hatched, and they're identified from the larva. But yes, FOMACHA is basically used for the barber pole worm. But for most people, or most farms, that is the primary parasite. And it is the most pathogenic parasite. But they can even get anemic. There are other causes of anemia, particularly nutritionally. And so if an animal is really down, like take coccidia, could have, not only does it have the diarrhea from that, but it could also be really run down in condition, and that could also cause anemia. So, but yeah, FOMACHA is just for the barber pole worm. Use the 5-point check and rate of gain and things like that for the others. And it's going to vary across the United States, because as we get into different climates, we can see the barber pole worm likes warmth and moisture. It was a tropical parasite. Now they find it under snow. So it's adapting. But you can have a different mix depending on where you're at. We're in the process right now of doing a fact sheet series on the other worms. You know, everything from tapeworms to strongyloides to the Meningeal worm. And hopefully that will be a useful resource for folks. That'll be on the WormX website. That's the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control, who are the folks that brought in the FOMACHA card. FOMACHA cards are now handled by Louisiana State University. That's where people will get the cards from. You have to take a training from a certified instructor in order to buy a card. Unless you're a veterinarian, then you can buy a card. Or you can get your veterinarian to buy a card. But it's good to take the training.
It is a very valuable training. I got my card through NC State.
Nice. Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that question. Let's see. Hi, Eddie. Thanks for joining us today. Eddie says, in terms of spreading manure on your pasture for optimal forage growth, could this be a contributor to parasites? Good question.
I think potentially it could be, because if the manure stays in the barn, not likely, except maybe strongyloides, but in terms of on the pasture, yes. Better to use composted manure, but sometimes that's not possible. But yes, the worst time you'd want to spread manure would be like in that springtime. Well, it's going to depend on where you're located, but yeah. And then often not only that, but you have restrictions on when you can spread it. Like in Maryland, we cannot spread it between December 15th and March 1st. Because we just can't. Which is when I would like to, because that's when parasites are a non-issue.
Right.
And but I would have concern about some concern.
Good
So
question.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, is that rule in Maryland due to it being spring and concern about runoff?
Yes, it's part of our nutrient management program.
Yeah.
You have to have a nutrient management plan in Maryland if you have 8 animal units or you make so much money. And so that's one of their restrictions. And you can't spread it on snow, things like that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So I spread mine on December 15th every year.
There you
I
go.
tried to do it. I lamb like in the second week in March, and I used to try to squeeze it in between March 1 and then. But you know how the weather can be bad in the spring, I know that's not the spring, but I mean in March. So that had to factor into it. So by the time my grass is getting growing and the manure is long been dissipated.
Yeah.
Great. Eddie also wants to know the name of the product you were talking about that traps and kills larvae in the manure pot.
The brand name it's called BioWorma. That's the one product contains like 34% fungus, and then there's a second product called Livamol, Livamol plus BioWorma. It contains 2.2% of fungus. The BioWorma has to be kind of mixed into a feed because its dosage is like 0.1 ounce per 100 pounds. The BioWorma is several. I'm trying to think how many ounces. You could theoretically top dress it, so you can use it directly. And so those are the two products. The fungus is called Dunningtonia flagrans, and research went into that for more than 20 years across most of the cattle, sheep, goats, horses. It'll probably work with poultry and swine too, but they don't have the data on that. And then it was introduced to our market finally a couple of years ago. And like I said, its biggest disadvantage is its cost because it seems to do the job. And hopefully, maybe if they sell enough here, maybe they'll reduce the price. I don't know why I say that, because does anything ever get reduced in price? But there's a lot of research that's going into it to see if we can come up with strategies that to use it. For example, can we use it to restore susceptible worms to a farm? So clean it up, and then introduce susceptible worms. Yes, worm with worms. Could we get the same effect if we, instead of feeding it every day, we fed it every other day or 2 weeks out of the month? That would essentially cut the cost in half. Can we get feed companies to, we're buying feed from Australia, Livamol, we're buying feed. Could we get local companies somebody to make a feed that wouldn't be as expensive as Livamol? And if you're big enough and you have feed mixed, or find a place that can mix feed, you can buy the BioWorma product, which is cheaper. But conceptually, it works. I mean, it's not going to kill every larva, but it's going to reduce it. I think most of the data shows between 60 and high 90s reduction. So it can be part of the toolbox, plugging it in at a certain time.
Thank you, Eddie. Let's see. Hi, Christine. Thanks for joining us today. Christine wants to know, are the non-symptomatic ewes not passing many parasites or the same as the symptomatic sheep?
It could be, you could have a sheep that has no symptoms that has a gazillion eggs per gram. She'd be resilient. You could have a symptomatic sheep that has no eggs. So vice versa. So if we want to decide whether or not to deworm, we're treating the symptomatic sheep, the ones with low fomatrospores, poor body condition, scours, things like that. If we want to create a resistant flock, we are going to do fecal egg counts. If we select on Fomatra only, we're going to be selecting for resistance some too. But again, it's not 1-to-1. It's probably a low to moderate correlation. So, but we will make progress selecting just on Fomatra. But if we could select on egg counts, that would be ideal. But when you want to know whether or not a sheep needs dewormed, you look at the sheep. If you want to know if it's resistant, you look at the poop. And if you had an asymptomatic one that was passing 50,000 eggs per gram, even though it looked perfect, you still might want to deworm that rascal because it's really in your pasture.
Yeah.
So yeah, but there's no reason if you think a sheep needs dewormed, there's no reason to do a fecal on it unless you want to test the efficacy of the treatment. You know, if it's a FAMACHA 3 and you're not sure, go ahead and deworm it. That's the middle one. You know, if it's a 1, you don't need to unless you see some other problem. But if you want to see if the deworm will work, if you want to test for drug resistance, if you want to, then that's where the fecals come in handy.
Thank you, Christine. Let's see. Also wanted to know, is copper deficiency noticed by wool eating / consumption?
The classic copper toxicity symptom in sheep is swayback. So a couple of years ago, I had a lamb just like that. I knew that my farm was marginally low in copper and marginally high in molybdenum. And then I got this lamb that had the classic swayback. But there are other things that we attribute to copper that might make people suspect. I don't think copper's the wool eating one. I'm trying to think if that's zinc or wool eating can also be boredom, lack of fiber in the diet. I don't think, but like it affects the crimp of wool. It affects pigmentation. You know, the color of the animals. In goats, they talk about something about their tail, fish tail. And I would say if you have, if you think you might have a copper deficiency, again, ideally you tested some livers. I know that's not always possible, but then you test the potential sources of copper. You know what? And usually you buy a feed. Whatever feed you buy, even if you buy it for sheep, it still has copper in it. They're not adding copper to it. But the mineral, test whatever. Even water can be a source of copper. Because where I grew up, we had copper pipes and we had high copper in our water. And we actually had an outbreak 1 year of copper toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you test your forages, usually you have to pay extra money to get all the minerals. You usually just get calcium and phosphorus with the standard forage test. But just be careful with copper. But find out if you have a deficiency. There are obviously minerals can provide copper, but also there are copper boluses that are for cattle and goats for copper supplementation. Mm-hmm. But just because things aren't going right doesn't mean it's a copper problem. But it could. An animal that's low in copper is going to be more susceptible to parasites. It's going to be more likely to be anemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Let's see.
We have a ton of questions here.
Christy wants to know if you can talk about prolapse prevention.
Which type of prolapse? Which type of prolapse? All of them? Rectal, vaginal? Or which one? Or you want me to talk about all of them?
Christy, if you're still with us, let us know which one you want. We'll see if she writes back. Let's see. How about from Mary Kate? She would like to know, do you have any advice for dealing with parasites like Meningeal Worm? Mm-hmm. We had that issue in a wether and treated it early. So now he's just a bit wobbly on his feet, but otherwise seems fine.
We had 101 lambs start our research project last year, and 6 got Meningeal Worm. Hmm. And eventually, after beginning treatment, we returned them to the farm, and I believe 5 out of 6 of them did recover. We used the Cornell University treatment protocol, which is, I think it's 5 days of fenbendazole, which is Safeguard, 5 times the dose, and an anti-inflammatory drug, dexamethasone preferred and for use in non-pregnant animals, and then Banamine if you had a pregnant animal. And that's going to be our best chance probably to, maybe some physical therapy too, best chance to get these animals back. But I think whatever permanent damage the worm has done, it can't be reversed. And nor does the treatment work on absolutely every animal. Cornell did a study with, treating a fair amount of them, and they had good luck, but it wasn't 100%. But it's a tough one because deer are everywhere, right? And of course, the worm has a intermediate host, which is a snail or slug, and so in some ways you can look at that as the control point, because when the larva gets in that snail or slug, that's what the sheep eats, and then it takes 10 days, 2 weeks before it goes from the digestive system to the central nervous system, and then once it's in the central nervous system, it's kind of traveling up the spinal cord on the way to the brain to kill the sheep, I guess, or paralyze it. So exclusionary fencing for deer is quite expensive. But where are areas that they might be exposed to the snails and slugs would be a kind of a control point. And then hitting them early. I think if you can do it early, then you're going to have a better chance. Most of our lambs that had it were detected early, and they had some hind end weakness is mostly what they had. You want me to go back to the prolapse one?
Yes, let's see. Christy
Guys,
says vaginal prolapse, please.
It's interesting to have a question about vaginal prolapse. On my Facebook page, I think it's either tomorrow or the next day, I've scheduled an infographic that has all the contributing factors to vaginal prolapse.
So go to the Facebook page.
I've got like 15 things on the list. And if we talk about heritability of things, like hoof growth, don't really know what percent heritable is. Vaginal prolapses are, I'm trying to think, they're like in the 10s. I know that rectal is only like 10 or 12. So the heritability is below 20. So but we know genetics are a cause. We can all cite that in seeing that animals that have gotten it from, where their parents had it or whatever. So, you definitely don't want to keep a ewe that prolapses. You don't want to keep her offspring if she prolapses. But just a lot of, I'm just trying to think of some of the things on that list, but there's just a lot of things that can contribute to it versus uterine, which we really don't know totally what causes that. But we really hone in on genetics on vaginal because we know it's a component of it, and we know that's a way to get rid of it. I find that it's going to be most common in my experience, personal experiences, it's most common in yearlings, and they're usually in pretty good body condition. So being fat, because think about it, you got a ewe carrying 2 or 3 lambs, and they're big, getting near to delivery, and she's got a digestive system full of feed, forage, and then she's so fat she's got internal fat, and this is particularly true of hair sheep. The Katahdin should never be allowed to get as fat as a Dorset, for example, because she's got so much more internal fat. Sometimes something's got to give, and that's what they push out. Once they lamb, a lot of times that problem that year is resolved, but she's more likely to prolapse again than one that didn't. So genetics is usually our best option for controlling. Feeding a really low quality forage makes the problem worse because she has to eat more, she gets fuller. If she can have a more concentrated source of energy, that will help. That's why it's customary to feed not necessarily a lot, but a little bit of grain in late pregnancy to meet that nutritional need. So there's a lot. There's just many things. It's just like rectal prolapses. It's a multifactorial problem. It's even they've even talked about short-tail docking on vaginal prolapses. Just but that's definitely a contributing factor on the rectals. And then, like I said, the uterine, we really don't know. People often thought it was a calcium deficiency, but that's never panned out in the research. And you can keep those girls. They can lamb another year.
Just to remind people that your Facebook page is the Maryland Small Ruminant page. So that's at MD Small Ruminant, all one word.
Yeah, and like I said, just in a couple of days, I'm going to post that all of 15 factors contributing to vaginal prolapse. because that's one of the most annoying things to have. I think most people, you're in that last month of pregnancy and you're so excited and the girls look good and oh, I can't wait for lambing, and then I see it.
Let's
Is
see.
that everything?
I think we've got like one or two more questions. So, Jan, thanks for joining us today. Jan wants to know, how quickly does the 1 to 2 year old ram usually move from body condition score 2 to score 3 to 4 when changing from feed ration that was just enough to sustain them at 2 to 1 that is optimal?
I just saw this similar question on Facebook.
Oh,
In the commercial sheep group. And
Oh,
I
sorry.
said, when you say an optimal ration, if you're, when we want an animal to grow, because that's what he's going to grow besides improving body condition score, we can balance that ration according to what the requirements are to grow. Or we can feed him a lesser ration to have him grow steady. And so, it's going to take the more concentrate that's in that ration, the faster he's going to get to. I wouldn't want to get into condition 4%, I guess 3.5. Because a lot of rams will lose body condition during the breeding season. And but he's not going to have to work for a while probably. And if he's not going to have to go back to work for a while, you could steady grow him. Maybe 2.5 might be a little bit better, but condition scoring is relative. We all score differently. But if you needed to get him back in condition because you needed him for you're going to spring breed, then you probably want more concentrate in that ration. I find that soy hulls is a pretty good thing to feed rams because it's a roughage. Where the rumen is concerned, it's a roughage, but it's high enough energy. Usually as high in energy as if you buy a complete feed from a feed store. But one of the things that's important about rams and wethers is when we talk about grain is make sure that calcium phosphorus ratio is at least 2 to 1. We don't want to predispose them to urinary calculi.
all right. Thank you. Let's see. I think our last question was from Brew, and Brew wanted to know a list of parasite-resistant sheep breeds. And we don't have a specific list. I do know if you go to our website, livestockconservancy.org, and you go to our sheep breed chart, I think it's on one of the sides.
The breeds
Yeah.
the breeds that are resistant, and again, that means they don't allow infection to get established. They self-cure sometimes, and they deposit fewer eggs. The breeds that are most resistant in the U.S. are the breeds that trace their ancestry to the Caribbean, which then traced its ancestry to North Africa. So that would be the St. Croix, which we consider to be the most resistant breed, and the Barbados blackbelly, which we don't have very many of in this country. We have the American blackbelly, one that we've crossed up. But I think that it's hard to know where that one fits in resistance. But definitely Barbados blackbelly has some resistance. Another group of resistant breeds is what we call the natives out of the Southeast. The Gulf Coast native, Florida native, Louisiana native, Florida cracker. There's different names and they're not necessarily the same breed. And the research hasn't necessarily been done on every single genetic type. But generally speaking, they are considered resistant, certainly more resistant than our traditional breeds. Personal opinion, they're an unappreciated resource. They grow medium wool. So that's another option. There is increasing evidence that the Texel may have better resistance than most of our terminal sire breeds and most of our conventional breeds. But it's not like they allow it. It's not the way they respond to the infection is not the same as the St. Croix. Then the other group, how can I forget Katahdin, right? So Katahdin is a composite breed. It's essentially in its most simplistic form, It was more complicated than this, but if you were going to make them all over again, you'd breed a St. Croix to a Suffolk. St. Croix is our most resistant breed. Suffolk's one of our most susceptible breeds. So the resistance of the Katahdin, they do have resistance. It's probably going to be somewhere between the hair sheep and the wool sheep. Now, heritage breeds and minor breeds, who knows? Because the research isn't typically been done with them. And you can't, if you have no problem with parasites, in no way does that mean your animals are more resistant. You might just deserve a pat on the back because you're doing a good job controlling parasites. We have to challenge them. I remember in our buck test, I had this lady from Indiana that did her own fecals. She had Kiko goats, and she said, and she got good fecals. And then when I started sending her data and they were in the thousands, it just blew her mind. Well, when she's trying to collect fecal egg counts, she's probably still trying to do a good job managing parasites. Mm-hmm. At our research station, 100 goats from all over and grazing, and we pre-infected the pastures, they were challenged. And so they had much higher egg counts. So to compare, to identify them, EBVs is what we can do, and estimated breeding values. That's basically, we can find the most resistant animals on our farm, but to determine a breed, the research has to be done. Actually, I'm sorry, EBVs don't work. They allow you to compare animals from different flocks. You need some university data to do a study. Or if on a farm somebody has two breeds they want to look, that sort of thing. But there are definitely some animals that have more resistance, and there's probably also a degree of hybrid vigor in it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we know I don't think we know the level of hybrid vigor. So just crossbreeding an animal, we know it helps with a lot of our fitness traits, but I don't think we know specifically with parasite resistance. But a lot of people believe that experts, whatever, that our answer to parasites is genetics. So for some people that can be selecting a resistant breed, for other people that can be making your animals more resistant by your selection program. Because if this year you didn't have much of a parasite problem, you can't assume you had resistant genetics. The next year you could have much more of a challenge and it could be a much bigger problem. But if you did have resistant genetics, you probably wouldn't have as big a problem. And we're learning more about that all the time, collecting more and more data all the time. You could probably raise St. Croix sheep and never have to do anything with worms. No, you wouldn't have very big lambs maybe, but you would have worms.
I take it back. Susan has a list.
Yeah, it's harder on goats. We don't have a lot of data to support that, but like I said, I think it's pretty exciting that the Texel seems to be better, because that gives us a breed that's an ideal sire for grass-fed lambs. Because Dorper, which a lot of people think is a hair sheep, they're not really a hair sheep, and they are more susceptible to parasites. There's some evidence that they might be more resilient in terms of clinical, but in terms of resistance and egg counts, I don't think they are. They're more like a wool sheep, even though they shed most of their coat. But anybody can select for resistance. Anybody can. You can. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's more heritable than number of lambs. It's more heritable than a vaginal prolapse. Wow. So, we can do that. But it's also hard. It's also challenging, because if you're too good a producer and you handle the parasites, you won't have enough egg counts to make the comparisons. Or if you don't have enough sheep, that's hard too. Mm-hmm. The only way we can select is if we've got differences. Mm-hmm. So if all your animals were under 1,000 eggs per gram, you couldn't select. You need more like 0 to 4,000. Mm-hmm. And you can't select on real low egg counts. So it's challenging, like I said, because a good producer, it's harder.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to wrap things up because we're at an hour and a half. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for your wonderful questions and for sticking through. And like the biggest thank you ever to Susan for answering all of those wonderful questions and sharing all of your amazing knowledge with us today. I learned so much more about sheep than I knew before, like and parasites and all these wonderful things.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
We're just going to do our quick little shameless plugs here at the end. Please do go and check out the Maryland Facebook page, the Maryland Small Ruminant page. There's a wealth of information from Susan there that you can find all the important things. So that's at MD Small Ruminant. So please go there. Some of the websites from earlier, that was wormx.info. And then was it sheepandgoat.com?
Mm-hmm.
And then sheep101.info. So there's all sorts of information that we talked about today. Nope. Is that not it?
No, I said yep.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a nope, and I was like, I typed it in wrong. I got too excited and typed the wrong one. So please do that. Susan, is there anything you want to plug as we're wrapping up today?
Nope. I think this was great. I enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you to ManaPro for sponsoring Sheep Chats today. Thank you to all of our members and supporters for making educational programming possible. We appreciate all of you. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. We appreciate you listening and liking and sharing and all those wonderful things and sharing good news. If you're not a member and you want to become a member or supporter, please go to our website. That's livestockconservancy.org and type away. Let us know. And become a member. Let us know if you have questions. If there's other programming you'd like to hear, we'd love to know about it so we can bring it to you right straight to your ears. Yes, join us next week. We are doing Woolly Wednesday. Yes, Woolly Wednesday. Who are we talking
with
to?
Mary Jean Packer from Battenkill Fiber Mills in New York, where we talk about working with your fiber mill.
Yay! That will be super fun. All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.